Thank you, François. Is that working? Yeah. So first, I'd like to thank you for this very nice conference that allows us to reflect on big perspectives on development and development economics. I think it's really a very enjoyable moment that I appreciate very much. My talk will be about stuff that is not directly related to what economists tend to talk about most of the time. The title is about institutions and culture as deep factors of development. Probably the big motivation for that talk is to address this question that is, I think, one of the fundamental questions on development economics, which is simply what accounts for economic prosperity and development. Okay? That's maybe the first question that people might have. And of course, then comes a second question, which is what stands at the origin of economic development and prosperity? So there, most of the time, people think in terms of two types of causes. Sort of the proximate causes economists tend to talk much about. I'll just mention basically the type of views that we had up to very recently. One way to look at those things is thinking that, well, if you have economic prosperity, we need to have growth. And one way to think about growth is just doing the same kind of things, but more of it. And it's that the typical type of growth models that were developed in the 60s and coming up on the emphasis on physical capital accumulation and human capital accumulation. And then, of course, we went to something a little bit more sophisticated. We thought that actually it's not enough to do more of the same thing, but also doing more things seems to be important, in particular emphasizing the role of knowledge in technology. And this is this whole literature on endogenous growth. And I think that if you read, there's a textbook by a very famous economist, Daron Acemoglu, on economic growth, where he says that essentially economic development is to try to go from trying to look at it from the point of view of proximate causes to deep causes. And what we mean by deep causes is those two things, culture and institutions. And institutions, you might say, it's like, well, emphasizing more the rules for doing things, and culture, the preferences and the values for doing things. And of course, it's institutions, we already talked about institutions quite a bit in that conference, and economists are pretty much easy with talking about institutions. They are sort of, until quite recently, they were less sort of favorable to talk about culture. And the reason why is because, of course, when we start to talk about culture, we start to move beyond our standard assumptions on our models, our ways of looking at the world, explanations of behaviors, and we in particular implies that we take a view about how preferences and values eventually get formed or change over time, which creates a number of difficulties in our analysis. And for a while, people were reluctant to look at this dimension, except leaving that to other social sciences, because we didn't have very much of a way to define what culture is first. And even if you think about this and you ask yourself, well, then maybe let me turn to anthropologists to tell me about something like what does it mean, culture? Then already, I mean, the famous anthropologists, Alfred Kroeber and Clyde Cleghorn, they had 165 definitions of what culture is. So for an economist, it's a kind of useless concept, and it's for a while the discussion stopped there. And then here I just adopted a definition of culture, which is coming from those three economists, which summarizes maybe in a more compact way what we need to include in our models and in our analysis. The set of shared attitudes, values, and goals and beliefs, so it's already quite large, but that depends on the capacity of learning and transmitting knowledge to succeeding generations. So what is essential here is, of course, it applies to these object preferences and attitudes, which yet is not very well defined, but still is certainly included in our definition of preferences, or the way we have we have behavioral implications, and it emphasizes two other dimensions. One that is necessarily group related, so it's specific to groups. It's not specific to an individual per se, and it comes through a process, and it evolves over time through a process of social learning, which means by that it's not either individual learning that you learn by yourself through experience and you readjust your behavior because you learn to do it better, but it's social learning. So again, this group emphasis is particularly important in that definition. Now, so what I'd like to talk about today is on this interaction between institutions and culture as important factors for development. So, of course, for institutions, we already know a little bit about what's going on. I mean, I just put up here sort of the first perspective that economists really started to emphasize very strongly on the institutional view on development. And of course, here those are sort of the, I will say, Nathan Noon named them the fundamental papers. I don't know if they are really fundamental, but they are sort of the papers that started really much that literature. Of course, I mean, already economic historians had in mind that institutions were important, but those guys here, I mean, whether those Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson, Hagerman, Sokolov, and Laporta, and others, they started really to sort of put that into a more systematic way of looking at the impact of institutions on economic performances, and typically looking at cross-country regressions, trying to understand and showing that institutions do matter to explain the variation of economic performances in the long run. And of course, that approach had been very much criticized, not only by economic historians, but as well by simply the fact that they were using particular methodologies that, as we know, have biases. And in particular, the advantage of that approach was that they were using sort of systematic, comparable institutional measures across countries, but also this had the inconvenience that those measures were pretty coarse, pretty having a number of biases, bundling different things together, and certainly not taking into account the degree of heterogeneity of what institutions mean at the local level or at the country level. So what is also characteristic of that kind of approach is that, of course, those authors were also very much aware that, well, institutions affect development, but we might say that also development affects institutions. So there's an endogeneity issue. And here, and all the literature that started along that line thought about finding some, what I call smart instruments, because very imaginative ways to introduce the role of geography or historical events to try to disentangle the causality running from institutions to growth. Now, that led to another perspective, which is related to the discussion we had yesterday on the roundtable, the micro perspective on institutions, where there the idea is to be much more local, and essentially a number of studies have started to emphasize the role of discontinuities of institutions in the same kind of geographical environment, so that in a sense you would control for many other of the omitted variables that you had in the previous type of perspective. And they're emphasizing, for instance, that if you look in Peru or in Bolivia across municipalities, some of which were subject to the meta system of forced labor in mines, in the silver mines in Peru in the colonial period, and other municipalities were not subject to that. But apparently the municipalities that were subject to that 200 years later had worse economic performances, in particular in terms of public good provision. There is, of course, the very, very famous example of Jared Diamond on Hispaniola, contrasting the divergent trajectories of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The Haitian part was colonized by the French, and the French intensively invested in slave-intensive type of agriculture, bringing them massively a number of slaves. The Spanish, who colonized the other side of the island, didn't do much, but actually that helped much better the Dominican Republic than Haiti in the long run. Actually, that's a kind of an example of reversal of fortunes based on the type of colonizer that came in that island. Acemoglu and other co-authors as well emphasize, for instance, as well, the goodness. I mean, we learned in the French history that Napoleon was a great man, at least when we were in primary schools. That may be actually not exactly the point of view of other European countries. And it's after my old trips around Europe that you realize that actually other Europeans have a different perspective about what Napoleon really is. But apparently Napoleon had some good side effects as well for the other countries that he invaded. In particular, depending on whether he was more or less some time in particular provinces in Prussia, he was able to implement then there the legal code system of the civil code system of France and reform the local administration. And apparently, even after being defeated, long time later, did have some kind of effect compared to other parts of Prussia that were not invaded by Napoleon conquest. And there are other examples, of course, also more related to India. Now, for culture, again, we had this kind of parallel type of view that developed more recently that emphasizes that culture, however you define it, has some kind of impact on development. And of course, we are very much inspired by the sort of traditional sociology, historical sociology of Max Weber and the emphasis on Protestantism on growth and development. Other economic historians as well, Gregory Clark, not for the same reason, but also emphasized the role of time preferences and the evolution of time preferences between the people who are rich and people who are poor as maybe one of the major determinants of why the Industrial Revolution started in England and not somewhere else. Joel Moore as well had this idea that the role of the gentleman or culture was favorable to the growth of innovation. And then after that, economists started, as they usually do, by looking at cross-country variations, taking one particular dimension that they can measure cross-country in a comparable way, one particular trait, I will say, trust, religion, generalized morality, individualism, and try to correlate that to growth outcomes. And finding, of course, most of the time that they had some positive effect or some correlation. Again, of course, they are aware of the limitations of this analysis, and they started to say that, well, we should use, again, smart instruments. So let's say that for trust and social capital between southern and northern Italy, we look at whether or not past historical events, such as the fact that a free city in northern Italy was the seat of a bishop, or the location of Etruscan city in the very far past, has influence on the level of social trust that still exists in those cities. And you might go even further by looking at very smart instruments related to linguistics or genetics. Linguistics, the fact that, for instance, in certain languages, there is a possibility to drop the high pronoun related to oneself, has implications for individualism, or trying to track a particular genetic marker that has no neutral genetic marker, so has no influence on fitness per se, and trying to compute some kind of genetic distances across regions, and looking at how those genetic distances might proxy for some distances in culture along one of those traits, and influencing therefore differentially economic performance. Now, again, there was similarly some kind of critique of those approaches, and we got into sort of a more micro perspective because, as I said, there was sort of more systematic data as well that allows at the individual level to keep track of the impact eventually of particular cultural traits on economic behavior, fertility and labor supply, for instance, collectivism, individualism, and contracts. The famous study by Havner Grace on the difference between the Genoans traders and the Maghrebi traders and the way they that affected their possibility to trade after the Middle Ages. The impact of Protestantism on growth in Prussian areas, going through human capital accumulation, or eventually the role of family values for the structure of home production, the labor supply, and fertility behaviors of women in Europe. And here, essentially, the idea is that you have two major ways through which you can try to disentangle the role of culture on economic performances. The first one is to just try to bring in the same environment people with different cultural backgrounds. So that will be those kind of experiments that have been done by this bunch of people. A lot of them are anthropologists. And what they did was something that actually, as an economist, could be a very natural way to look at things. And we were surprised that anthropology didn't look at this way before. Basically, you take some games reflecting some kind of social interactions, and you go and see if, given different environments in which people are, cultural backgrounds, they play the game the same way. And this is what they did by looking at whether or not they could disentangle the possibility for reciprocity, and directly or indirectly, in a number of small-scale societies, and trying then to correlate the environment of those small-scale societies to the results of their experiments. So that's one particular way to do those things. And what they found in particular is that, well, it seems to be a correlation between the degree of access to markets of those small-scale societies and the extent of reciprocity. Reciprocity meaning by that of course, when you play a trust game, you reciprocate. You basically, when people send you something, you send it back to him with a bigger return. Or indirect reciprocity, which is that if you see somebody cheating on a second person, you don't like that, even if it's not you who are the victim of being cheated, but you are ready at a cost to yourself to punish that person because you feel it's not fair, it's not right. Now, the other way also to look at the mechanism through which culture can affect economic behavior is to say that culture essentially is a process, and I'm going to return to that later in my talk, a process of transmission. And that, as it is a process of transmission, it's a little bit like a virus. So then, if it's a virus, why not try to be inspired by the epidemiology literature? And there, the idea is that let's take an event where we know that the virus diffuses in a certain way in a particular background, but actually we don't want to understand that because the background interacts also with that particular way the virus is diffusing. But for some reason, there's some event that makes the virus jump the ocean and go to another country. And there, inside the same environment, the virus diffuses. And there you can try to take what is going on in that new environment and see if it has an effect on the environment of the ancestors of the migrants. Okay? So keeping track of this, and this is called the epidemiology literature, and that's a way through which, for instance, you can understand whether or not certain types of values like trust had implications on growth. That is, trust of immigrants, of European immigrants in the United States can be correlated with growth performances of the region of origins in Europe. So that's another way through which economists have been quite imaginative to reduce as much as possible the issue of dual causality. 10 minutes, yes. So, all right. Now, what I'd like to say is that there are three major obvious observations about institutional culture. They are group-related, they are persistent, and there's coevolution. And I'm going to switch persistence, it's kind of obvious. Persistence of culture, I've got nice examples here, but I don't have much time to talk about them. Maybe just one of them is that actually there are some guys that found that when we are in the period of the football games now, right? And there's those guys, Miguel, Said, and Satiana, who found that if you take the major football leagues, France, Spain, England, Italy, and you look at the number of red cartons or yellow cartons the players receive, and you have the characteristics of those players. And then you try to correlate that to something. And what you find is that guys that come from countries that are subject to more civil wars or conflicts tend to, in the French league or the Spanish league or the English league, tend to be subject to more yellow cartons and red cartons. So in a sense, there might be a mechanism for which a certain cultural violence gets transmitted, right? And there are other examples like that. As well, a very recent paper by Pauline Grosjean and Susan Clatter looking at Australia. Australia was a country where you had migration and a very imbalanced sex ratio, many more men than women. but there's variation across districts. And then what you see is that the more the sex ratio was imbalanced, the more likely now, if you look at subjective surveys on attitudes, in those districts, attitudes are more conservative. Why? There is a reason that is explained by this paper, but I'm not going to have time to go into that. So essentially, what I wanted to emphasize is that all this literature looked at the question of growth or development by looking at institutions are important for growth. Culture is important for growth. And of course, the natural way to think about those things may not be to look at as if institutions are good for growth or culture is good for growth, but the fact that they co-evolve. And this co-evolution process per se is exactly the reason why we do observe at the same time so much persistence of both factors affecting economic performances. So I'm going to go over also the examples suggesting that culture is affected by institutions or institution is affected by culture or that they co-evolved. But just I want to emphasize that now you should probably shift the literature away from the myth of the origin. The myth of the origin is simply to try to find one causal effect that tells you about growth, development, prosperity, or whatever, and to maybe focus more our analysis on the interaction of those different factors, institutions, culture, geography, and history, and the way they interact, how they generate persistence or not. This is, I think, the more interesting research program. So now, getting into my last 8 minutes, maybe 6 minutes, into, that was a talk with words. Now let's get into equations, a little bit of pleasure still. I sort of started to develop with my co-author Alberto Bizin a framework that tries to emphasize this idea of interactions and to be more sort of a framework to help us think about this co-evolutionary process between culture and institutions. And in particular, trying to look more precisely at the question, which we think is the more important question right now, whether the two of them are evolving in a complementary way or in a substitutable way. In other words, whether they reinforce each other or mitigate each other, because that will have implications. If you have an exogenous institutional shock, then that shock can be maybe magnified by cultural evolution, but it might be mitigated as well. It may be magnified, for instance, if you think that, well, you have a situation where you want to protect more property rights. Protecting more property rights allows more cooperative behavior. As cooperative behavior is good, people tend to transmit that behavior in populations, and a population with more people cooperative might want to design and implement more property rights. That's a way where you have this kind of complementarity. A case where you have maybe some substitutability is a case where the work ethic allows for the construction of the welfare state. Welfare state implies transfers. Transfers make people lazy. People lazy tend to work less. The taxes to pay for the transfers are reduced, and therefore that tends to make the welfare state to be reformed in a way which is less redistributive. So that will be a situation of substitutabilities, and that has been emphasized actually by some Swedish economists. So it's not coming from the French economists yet, but maybe it will. So what we do here in this paper is simply to provide a very simple framework, formal framework, and trying to understand those complementarities and suitabilities between cultural and institutional evolution in a very simple way, and then try to apply that to caricatural or stilized examples of social interactions. Typically, a situation where you have a problem of public good provision, or a situation where you want to internalize some externalities, or a problem of shifting resources from one sector to another, or a problem of how to resolve conflicts and protection. So, and I'm not going to get into the equations. I won't have time to get into the equations, so I'm going to just tell you a little bit more about what is behind the structure of the framework. The structure of the framework will be simply institutions. We'll be viewing institutions in a very abstract way. We want to be relatively general in that, or very agnostic. There are many ways for which you can model institutions, and institutions, of course, have very specific characters. But here we will model institutions just as a simple mechanism design approach, meaning by that society has to organize things in a certain way, given the fundamentals of the society, and in particular the structure of groups that exist in the society, the cultural diversity of groups in the society. Now, the institutional framework is just, we'll model that as a distribution of weights, how important are those different groups and represented in the way you can implement public policies. But people, on top of public policy, they can behave privately, have some private actions. We have still some freedom to do something, and it interacts with this centralized decision-making process that reflects the power or the representativeness of the different cultural groups in society. They will model institutional change simply as a change of those weights over time. But how those weights will be changed? Well, we take the view that there is persistence, as the evidence suggests, of institutional change. Typically, the structure of weights of today on how you represent the different groups in society will have implications for the structure of weights that are going to be designed for the next period or the next generation. In which way? In a way which is that through the lens of the current structure of weights of society or the structure of de jure institutional details, you will think about, should I change or not those weights to improve my situation in the future, okay? And that generates a process by which those weights will evolve. And they will evolve based on the profile of the different groups, and those groups will reflect different traits, okay? And there will be some policies implemented. So because you're going to have the structure of preferences of the representation of people today on tomorrow, there is persistence, and culture of today will affect the policies decided today, which means that's going to have implications for the change of weights in the future. For cultural change, here I will adopt a model that I developed with Alberto, which emphasizes two features. The first one is that cultural transmission goes from generations to generations, and therefore is transmitted from parents to kids in particular, but also society has an effect. So there are different mechanisms to which new generations can be socialized to different cultural traits. Parents, society, teachers, different ways. Direct socialization, as it said, oblique socialization, or peers, okay? But these socialization mechanisms are not purely mechanistic. Parents do invest resources. They tend to defend themselves when they feel their identity are threatened. They tend to invest money to make their kids go to specific schools or to spend time with them, making sure that their preferences or their values get transmitted to their kids, okay? And they do that in a sort of strategic way. They are altruistic, but in an imperfect way. They are paternalistic, okay? So they view best the interest of their kids, but not from the point of view of the kids, but from the point of view of themselves. There is this filter of perception that matters. Of course, because they take into account the point of view of the kid, they understand as well that the kids and the next generation will live in another society with other structure of institutions and policies. And therefore, this is the mechanism through which the institutions of today or tomorrow, as expected by tomorrow, will affect the process of transmission of parents and society to the next generation, and therefore will affect a process of evolution of preferences in the population. And now you combine those two types of frameworks together. On one hand, institutions change over generations because they have incentives to change the weights of the representation of the different groups, depending on the structure of society. On the other hand, society evolves also the underlying values because of a process of intergenerational transmission of traits that depends on what parents expect for their kids in the future. When you interact the two, you get to a nice number of equations that I'm just going through, and then you get to situations where you want to understand to which point we get in the long run. And in the long run, there are different situations that can exist depending, of course, on the problem you look at, whether this is a public good provision problem, an externality problem, a redistributive problem, or a problem of subsidizing the dynamics of one particular sector at the expense of another sector, a structural change problem, for instance. Some situations occur where actually the steady state situation reflects that culture and institutions are substitutes. And in that case, a shock on one of those dimensions will be mitigated by the evolution of the other variable. Other situations reflect a situation where they get magnified, they get complement, and actually this comes much more often than the other case. But where, in a sense, there are some multiplier effect. There's a cultural multiplier effect in the long run, as well as there might be an institutional multiplier effect, depending on which one is the exogenous shock coming from geography or or history. Now, I'm going to conclude. Of course, I skipped all the technical aspects, but what this kind of model brings you is exactly a framework in which you can try to analyze this co-evolutionary process between institutions and culture. What it doesn't say is how fast we go, the speed. And I guess that's one of the major challenges that now those literature should address, which is, well, if we have a policy implication on one dimension, what changes faster, institutions or culture? Do they then magnify each other? Do they mitigate each other? Supposedly, when you look at the example that Jean-Philippe was saying this morning, there are some ways through which there's mitigation. When you start to introduce a particular law system, it might not work like this, because actually parents or communities tend to substitute the way because they feel threatened. And in that case, you might want to invest resources in one particular type of formal policy, but it's going to be mitigated by the responses. And in that particular example that he was suggesting, there is really a cultural element that suggests there is a substitution. Now, of course, there are many other dimensions that we can look at through this framework, some of which are how far institutions are designed or evolve in a decentralized manner, how far institutions are interacting with each other, different types of institutions, how far culture is interacting also in the implementation of institutions. This is also the feature about de jure versus de facto differences. And finally, in social biology, there is something that was not much fashionable in biology, but became much more fashionable and probably more adapted to the evolution of social systems, is the fact that at the end of the day, as I was saying, the common feature about institutions and culture is that they are group related. But if they are group related, it means that the mechanisms through which they evolve are selection mechanisms that are at different levels, multi-level selection mechanisms, in particular the importance of group selection in terms of, and how this group selection would itself be depending eventually endogenously on the way you frame institutions, because institutions are ways to also provide frontiers and borders on groups, separate groups from others, and that has effects on how they evolve over time. I'm going to stop here.